I will now turn to Chris Warrren, who is media correspondent of Crikey, and of course, somebody who knows not just the Australian media really well, but has been a former president of the International Federation of Journalists. And he and I were fortunate to go on a fact-finding mission on the state of press freedom in Sri Lanka many years ago. So I've known you for a long time, and you've always been a go-to person to understand what's happening in Australia. So please give us your sense of what are the issues that animate the Australian media today.
When Australia hosted the G20 back in 2014, I participated in one of the parallel acronyms that Siddharth mentioned in opening, which was the L20 for labour unions. I remember thinking then how valuable something like this sort of get-together would be for journalists and independent media. So I just want to say it's great to see our Indian friends, as they so often do, have gone beyond my own idle pondering into actual organising action. So congratulations to you and the organising committee. To me, what makes a gathering of journalists from the G20 countries so valuable is that it cuts across one of the big blockages to the spread of news and information. The global supply chain for news is still mainly funneled through the North Atlantic, through those big news centres of East Coast USA, mainly New York, and Western Europe, still mainly London. But as global relations fragment and shift, we need to think ourselves away from into the centre, out to the periphery of news distribution, into the power of the network of one to many and many to one. And the global reach of the G20 nations and the respective networks within their own regions that they have is a great opportunity, I think, to help that news sharing process along. So I'm particularly delighted to be on the ground floor of what I hope will become a significant part of the global infrastructure of a free media. Now, Australia doesn't confront the sort of authoritarian challenges that so many of you have already spoken about. To be honest, there is something to be said for having a low-key politics, although it can be frustrating for us as journalists when we're looking for news to report from day to day. But rather than complacency, that should encourage an enthusiasm for reimagining the sort of news our peoples need. Instead, unfortunately, press diversity in Australia, pluralism of news and opinion, remains under threat. Ownership of traditional media remains heavily concentrated, mostly now owned by just two corporations, one local and the other the more culturally and politically powerful US-owned News Corporation. And that raises three specific challenges in the current moment that I wanted to talk about. First, the products in which our journalism appears have been consolidated. Almost all corporate-owned regional media either stopped printing or closed altogether under the cover of COVID in 2020. Media is now wholly national in its perspective, and state or city mastheads, to the extent they endure, remain only as branding devices. Second, that lack of pluralism has fed a uniformity of what makes news: parliamentary politics, crime and disasters, weather, although of course rarely climate. And that uniformity has been reflected in the news choices too of our national broadcaster, the ABC and SBS. And third, it acts to disadvantage emerging independent media, and of course I work in independent media, so I'm talking my own book here, as the large corporations have been able to dominate funding from the big tech platforms, with 90% of money paid by Meta and Google under the legislated news media bargaining code that's generated so much worldwide interest, has been going to the big two corporations. Right now, Australia faces a crisis of misinformation driven by the rise of ethno-nationalist populism. Parenthetically, I might note that both in Australia and India, we share something common in this in that in both countries, the populist right are attempting to implicate our shared national sport of cricket in their nefarious schemes, to the outrage of all of us. By quick background to the current crisis in Australia, in 2017, Australia's First Nations issued the Uluru Statement from the Heart, calling for a constitutionally mandated Indigenous voice to the National Parliament. Last year, the newly elected Labor government agreed to submit the question to a national referendum, with the vote scheduled to be held on October 14 this year. Australia's populist right has taken this proposal for an Indigenous voice just about as well as you might expect. And Australian journalism is struggling to deal with the embrace of misinformation and downright disinformation by conservative politics and media through the craft's traditional truth-based tools. Indigenous journalists, like First Nations elders and leaders, have been abused and attacked, including by political leaders and senior journalists who should know better, in some of the most appalling and racist terms. One big issue that does unite Australia's media is the demand for freedom of Australian journalist Julian Assange, jailed by one G20 member, the UK, at the request of another, the US. We're also deeply concerned at the continued detention in a third G20 member, China, of Australian broadcaster Cheng Lei and writer Yang Hengjun. Okay, maybe time for some good news. There are early signs that recent amendments to the national defamation laws to add a public interest defence test are acting to restrain slapperists in Australia. Again, I admit a self-interest, or at least a self-interest on behalf of Crikey, who I write for. The first major test of the law was set to be a case initiated by a US media oligarch who may be known to some of you, Lachlan Murdoch, over the suggestion by one of our columnists that the fake news on...
Thank you, Chris. Sadly, we lost, I would say, about half a minute of your audio because you were lagging. But I see that you have some kind of a written text, so it would be great if you could share it with me, then I can circulate it to everybody so that nobody misses anything. Yeah?
Yes, I can do that.
All right, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. That was great.